So you write here that most content management systems fill authors with dread starting at the login screen. Let's start. There is no better place to start than the feeling of dread at a login screen. Let's start there. Please explain as if I don't know exactly what you're talking about.
Right. I think that the problem is, and the first time they log into it, they're not filled with dread. The dread is the existential dread of knowing what's to come because you've been dealing with it for a long time, right? But I think the biggest problem with content authoring is that nobody thinks about it, right? It's like I remember that the first Drupal project I ever did actually was for the Seattle Times, and we were putting together a Drupal site that they had like 15 hand-grown content management systems, and we were bringing them all into one thing, and and we put it together and we launched it. And on the first day that we launched it, the editors kept coming over to me and saying, "Where's this functionality that I used to have, or where's this thing that I need to do and stuff?" And I realized that the reason why they were asking that is because we had never talked to them about their work, right? We had put together a design and we had user tested it and all of this stuff, but we never actually talked to the people who actually use the system every day, all day long. And it was really eye-opening for me, like these are the people who make all of the content work, and in many cases are completely disenfranchised from the process of building the tool that they use all the time. And I think I've said in several places that I was at Confab a few years ago, and a woman, Laura Robinson, was on the stage, and she said, "Raise your hand if you love your content management system," and nobody raised their hand. And that's why, because the content management systems are not built with their needs in mind. They're all of these other needs, except for the people who use them. And that's really, I think, where the dread comes from. It's just like you're using a tool that never considered you. And, that dread would come from any tool that you would use that way. I mean, we probably have, examples all over our lives of tools like that. But the difference is that using those tools is not our job. Right?
Yeah.
It's not tied to our livelihood. And I think that's part of one of the reasons that I really have been spending a lot of time thinking about this topic over the last, decade or so, is because like there's this, group of people who are just like stuck, and I think that's a bummer and it's not cool.
Who are content management systems built for if not for content managers?
I know, right?
Right?
I mean, when you look
Is
at
it
it,
like the IT people? Like who's it built for?
well, I think you and I have been in this industry a long time, and I think we've seen the answer to that change over
Mm,
time. Like, when we first started, I think it was very much that developers and IT people drove content management system choices and implementations. And I think now it's definitely moved, and then there was a period where it was more of an executive decision. And I think now we're getting into a place where marketing often drives that decision more. But, at the end of the day, content management systems are built for the people signing the checks to build a content management system. And the last person that's going to be is the person who's using it every day. Like we both work in an agency settings, and the people who sign the checks are our clients. And so they're the people that we have to respond to when they come to us with goals and priorities and all of those things. And I come into all of those meetings up front saying we have to get these people involved and these people involved and these people involved up front. But at the end of the day, the whatever priorities they have as an organization are what drives content management system building. And it may be, hitting these KPIs or hitting these conversions or getting this new design system implemented, or Drupal 7 is end of life and we've got to move, or whatever it is. But at the end of the day, like nobody signs checks to improve content authoring. And yet I would say that content author dissatisfaction is often one of the things that drives CMS change. But like nobody, because people those content authors, like when they're miserable, they're not quiet about it often. We do meetings and workshops with them, and they have lots to say. But then when the project gets resolved, like all of these other people come in and like take it over, and that all gets lost.
Yep. One of the things that I've seen, I don't know if this is a trend lately because to be honest, it's been a few years since I've worked directly on a project. Um, One of the things that I saw for many years as I was working hands on in the discovery and build phases of content management projects was this comparison that a lot of the stakeholders on the content management, editorial, and admin side of things would make. They would constantly compare everything to WordPress because that was usually the first content management system that they themselves fully owned, whether it was because it was the first website that they propped up themselves, or it was the first kind of website that they were like raised on professionally, or whatever the situation was. And so that the bar, wherever that bar was, it was set in terms of ease of use and expectations in terms of where to find things and user interface and all of that. It was set in terms of WordPress. I'm curious if you found that is still the case, or if there's a different system or a new kind of bar that's been set with things like, I don't know, Webflow or other tools that have come into play in the intervening years.
I still see a lot of people who basically just want an editor and a title. So basically that's WordPress in the traditional sense, or, your standard kind of out of the box basic Drupal install or whatever.
Hmm.
Um, and I do see a lot of people now who have more experience with a Squarespace like approach, and expect that. Um, but the problem is that like a Squarespace like approach doesn't work for most of the more complex organizations that we work with. And a basic page approach doesn't work either. And one of the things that's really hard, I actually have a whole section of my book about this, is that while I think that content management systems have matured and become more easy to use in the last decade. The demands on content have become much greater and much more complicated. When we think about needing to design content around accessibility, around mobile friendliness, around SEO needs, around omnichannel, there's a lot of thought and structure and composition, taxonomy, organizational principles that comes along with that content that dropping a bunch of words into a basic page doesn't work with. And that's where I think a lot of these projects fall apart, is that they design the system for that complexity but then never think about how people are going to interact with that complexity. Like something simple that I still see all the time, it's been a problem in Drupal projects forever, is like if you've got a piece of content that's connected to another piece of content. Like say you've got a blog post and it has an author, and that author isn't in the system already. How do you get that author added without having to like eject from the piece of content that you're already working on, right? And
Yeah.
it's like we still encounter that concept constantly. To ask somebody to stop what they're doing, go somewhere else, add this thing, and then come back and find the thing that they were working on in the first place is a terrible experience. It completely takes them out of it. And I still see that like on like there's a headless system that just bragged that they added this feature to be able to do it in context on their most recent release. It's like the kind of thing that people don't think about very often, and those are the kinds of things where that complexity is necessary to build the system, but nobody thinks about how to make it work for the people who are doing it. And that's where that combination, and that's why people want WordPress, right? I don't want to
Yeah.
have to jump out to do this other thing. I don't want to have to think about all of this crap. I just want to enter my words into a screen. And
Yep.
that's the failure basically that I see.
Hmm. You mentioned your book. Let's
Hmm.
talk about that. So you're here because you have written, almost completed a book.
Kind of,
Uh,
yeah.
Tell us about it.
So several years ago, I did a project. Lullabot did a project for the state of Georgia, and I came out of it with a lot of bees in my head. It was a very big project, and one of the things that I was thinking about a lot was authoring experience. And we had talked a lot with the content authors at the state and spent a lot of time trying to make a good experience for them there. And I was kind of like, it kind of like sat in my head for a couple of years, like a bunch of related information and what was it and what did I want to turn it into. And this was one of the things that came out of that. And so a couple of years ago, I put a pitch together and sent it out to, sort of my dream publisher. And and to my great shock, they said, yes, let's do this. And so well, first I was like, oh God, now I've actually got to write a book. But then I got to work, and I spent 6 months together, and I put together a 35,000 page draft. And I had just gotten my first edits back from them when I got news from their CEO that they were halting all of their new production projects because of a massive slowdown in sales that they had seen. This was right at the beginning of the time when all of the big tech layoffs were happening, and and that they didn't know when they were going to be able to resume any of them, if they were going to be able to resume any of them, but they were halting them all until the end of the year. This was like in March. And if anybody wanted out of their contracts, they could do so and find another venue for their work. And I talked with them a bit and was like, and while they didn't come out and say it, like to me, if they're going to let you out of your contracts, they're not really intending to pick things up again. And so I started, they made some intros to me to other publishers, and none of that went anywhere. And the situation I was in is I had this book, but I knew I couldn't edit the book myself. Like that is not a skill set that I have. And then if it's going to get published, it needs to be designed and laid out and stuff like that. And those are also not skill sets I had. So what I would need to do is hire somebody to do those things. And whether it was somebody I knew or somebody I didn't, like somebody's going to get paid to do this work. And that was the money that I would need to raise in order to get the book out the door. And, I looked at a couple of options that didn't pan out. And so I have one of my colleagues, Matt Robison, had published some children's books using Kickstarter. And so I talked to him about his experience and what to do. And this was in January. And one of the things I realized was that from a January is a really good time to run a Kickstarter because you get a year in order to run it, and then there's like tax stuff basically, but basically you can't deduct all of your stuff unless it's in the same year that you earn your money, right? And so like if you do it in January, and that means I have to have all of my stuff, all of my expenses done by the end of the year. And so it suddenly just like made sense that this was, if I was going to do it, this was a really good time. And so that was when I finally made the decision to start putting it together, start putting all my assets together, begin the incredibly painful process of trying to sell myself and my book before it's even done. Because on Kickstarter, you're basically marketing your product before it's finished. And so that's what happened. And I launched it about a week and a half ago. I'm currently sitting at 49% funded as we record this. And it's been a ride.
I bet. So, designing content authoring experiences is the title of the book.
Yeah.
So, you said that this was inspired in large part from your work with the state of Georgia, but of course, it draws on, decades of experience working on the web and many years of experience specifically working with content management systems and Drupal in particular, I assume.
Yeah.
What are some of the key points that you want to make in this book and some of the things that you want to communicate about the authoring experience in content management systems?
I think one of the big things is that the content authors are just a user of your system. They're just not the user we usually think about when people are thinking about website users, right? They're usually thinking about their external users, the people who visit the website. But if you think about your content authors also as users of your website, then you can apply a lot of the same skills and processes that you do to design for your external users to design for your internal users as well. There's user research that you can do to find out about them and their needs and the things that they're suffering under right now and the problems that they're encountering. You can find out about them and like the kinds of content that they produce and how you can, work with the system to work better with the kind of content that they produce every day. Are they uploading PDFs every day? Then maybe you need to think more about document management. Are they writing things that have to go through several levels of workflow? Then maybe that's something you need to look at as a more integrated part of your system than you would have before,
Workflow meaning like different levels of like editorial steps and approval. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And are there maybe dashboards or other areas to manage that workflow that you can build to make it easier to find the things that they need to at any given time. With Georgia, we actually did some really interesting paper prototyping. So we did a flexible component based page builder kind of thing for Georgia, and we had designed a bunch of components, but we wanted to make sure that they would meet agency author needs. And so what we did, this was my former colleague Jeff Eaton, this was his idea. Basically, we took a big piece of board and covered it, and he had it laminated, and then we could, like, first of all, he made index cards that represented different types of components that we could bring in and move around and talk to them about the kind of content they needed and would they be able to fit it in this kind of component. But since it was laminated, you could also dry erase marker on it. And so, like, we would sit with groups of content authors from different government agencies talking about the things that they needed to do and whether they could represent them. And then we had a pile of blank index cards, and we would just say, what if we did this, and draw something up and drop it on there, and they'd be like, oh yeah, that's great, And so, like, these kinds of prototyping exercises, whether they be paper or digital, are again something that often happens in traditional website research that doesn't happen on the authoring experience side. And and then of course the process of testing and iteration and development of functionality and all of that, the process is very similar in something that we're all very aware of. It had a lot of the actual skills have different spins on them. For instance, a lot of content authoring is filling out forms, and so there are general form principles that you can apply to that. But also, like, a lot of forms on the web are meant to be filled out once, whereas somebody has to fill out this content authoring form maybe thousands of times in their career, right? And so, like, there are different reasons why you would do different things because of that. So, a lot of the basic principles are things we're familiar with. It's just a matter of applying them to a different context and thinking about them in a different way.
What would be an example of that, like a form that somebody might encounter once as an end user on a website, and on that same website on the back end, that a content author encounters 1,000 times in their career, that you have to approach differently or design differently or have behave differently as a result?
Yeah, I think one of the big things is thinking much more carefully about the cognitive load of the form and its design, because, if you encounter something once and it's kind of confusing, but at least you can figure it out and never have to deal with it again. Whereas if you're dealing with something repeatedly, a lot of those issues can really add up, right? Mm-hmm. And so that can have to do with how content is organized in a content entry form, or the type of explanation text that's around it for people who are new, or the amount of visual space or things that are close to or far away from each other. Like, anything you can do to reduce the mental workload of that form is going to exponentially gain because somebody's in those forms all day long. Like, if somebody has to do 2 extra clicks to do something, now you magnify that times every single piece of content they have to enter for the rest of that system's life. It's a lot. And I think that's really one of the bigger things about about like things. It seems like, oh, it's just this one thing, but for that person it's not just that one thing, because they're dealing with it every single day.
Mhm.
And that exponential factors, I think, are a really big deal, where a lot of these things maybe require a little more care.
How do you encourage clients to adopt a culture of iteration and improvement for the back end in the same way that they might respect that or want to pursue that for the end user for the front end of the website?
It's hard, you know. I mean, it's hard getting the resources to focus on it in the first place. I think one of the things that we've done at Lullabot is uh, our director of technology, Andrew Barry, has been writing about what we do. We're called architectural decision records, basically. And they kind of define the principles by which we build websites.
Hmm.
And we've been thinking about like some of the things that we do for content authoring as well as part of that. Like, for instance, like I did a big thread on our discussion board recently about the topic of not being able to contextually deal with connected content from the context that you're in, right? And what the best solutions we could offer that we could make part of sort of our standard builds would be, so that we don't have to worry about this going forward. And um, so from our perspective, I would say that the work has been figuring out how we can offer it as part of what we already do day to day, rather than trying to convince the clients to invest in it. Because especially in the current environment, budgets are tight, projects are quicker. And I think that trying to sell all of this extra work into paying attention to this is a little bit of a losing battle. But we still want to improve it. So what can we do on our side to make sure that we can still do quick and efficient projects that take this into account?
Hmm.
um, like, another thing that I always do when I'm laying out content types is I define what order the fields should be on the form. Because from my perspective, you spend a lot of time thinking about the hierarchy of content on your front page, and there's a hierarchy of content on the node edit form as well. Um, and so and a lot of times, like when those pages are built, the fields are laid out pretty haphazardly, just like in the order you build them or whatever. But if you can put that hierarchy together in a way that makes sense for the author, that's like less time they have to hunt and find things, or they encounter them in the order that they expect them to be. And so, getting all of that stuff out of the way as part of our normal process is a really big thing. I think on the client side, one of the things that we try, and that I always try and tell them, is that if your content authoring experience is terrible, people don't want to use your system. And if people don't want to use your system, then your content is going to suffer. And so,
Absolutely.
and it's going to suffer either because they don't spend the time that it deserves to get it in, or because they don't go back to check it and update it and it becomes out of date. It's like you're going to pay that price one way or the other. And so you should invest in this to the extent that you can, because you're not going to meet your goals and priorities for your system if you don't. And that's like the biggest point that I always try to make on the client side.
One of the topics that comes up quite a bit in content creation and management, something that's really popular these days is making content more modular.
Mm-hmm.
And people call that different things. Sometimes people refer to like tokenization of content, and that's a different concept, but it's related.
Composable
It's
content. Yeah.
composable content, right?
Mm-hmm.
Basically, the idea that you don't think of content as one giant blob, but you think of it as all of these different pieces that can be remixed and reused in specific contexts. And that's a good thing for presentation because it allows you to represent that content in the right way at the right time on the right kind of device. Uh, so it's great for the end user. And it can be great for the content author because if you're trying to repurpose content, which is kind of the name of the game these days, right? Like
Yeah.
a good, solid content strategy starts with content as more of a concept, as like a central story that you want to tell, and then you have all of these assets that sort of orbit that story. So you may have a bunch of images that become the slideshow iteration of that story, and maybe there's a lot of audio that becomes like the podcast version of that story or whatever. Uh, but from a content authoring perspective, when you're then trying to manage that in a CMS, do you find yourself, do you find that the content editors, how do I phrase this? Is there like a tipping point where the complexity of the content management system of trying to manage all these composable elements outweighs the usefulness, like outweighs the utility, and almost becomes too much of a burden, and then makes people just want to escape the whole system and want to go back to what is this perceived simplicity of like the blob of content?
I think it depends. One of the things that I spend a lot of time talking about in the book is that like no solution is best for everybody. And one of the things that I encounter in what you're talking about is, for instance, people try and be very composable because they think it's the right thing to do, but they do it in organizations or situations where they're not getting much benefit out of it to begin with.
Mm.
And so they increase the complexity beyond what they actually need. And then the other problem I see is that people underhire for situations that require more specialized knowledge. So for instance, if you're working with the kind of content that you think are that we're talking about, where it's highly composed, where you have to think about the content in more of an abstract way in how you compose pages in different contexts and things like that, you need somebody who's a little more well versed in probably how the web works, how corporate communication strategies work, how how content strategy works. What you don't need is somebody whose job is half time entering information into the website and half time doing other duties at their job, which is what we encounter a lot. And like when we did the Georgia project, we abandoned a lot of more complex workflows or functionality because we knew they had mostly subject matter experts working with their system. And we didn't want to build in so much that they wouldn't be able to deal with it. Like we encounter, especially with government and higher ed clients, like that the content editors and authors even have a hard time kind of envisioning in their mind what a global taxonomy looks like on their site and how to apply it to certain pieces of content, like they find it very difficult to grasp anything beyond the page that they're working on. And so if your content authors are in that situation, then you're doing yourself a disservice shoving them into a situation where it's a composable, highly, abstracted, authoring experience, because they're just not prepared for it. They're not going to use it to the effect that they should. And so some of that is about authoring experiences becoming more complex. And some of it is also about clients getting sort of, marketed to about what they need when in some cases they probably don't actually need it. And then some of it is about them not thinking about what it takes to staff those systems in a way that you can take the most advantage of it. And so there's like a lot of elements at play there that kind of, come together to decide what the best solution is for you.
What kind of organization, or maybe use case is a better way to frame it, would benefit from a highly composable system?
I actually think that universities have a lot of benefit to be had from a highly composable system. I think a lot of e-commerce or, sort of more product-based companies obviously do, but because, they can do things like they've got product information that they can break out into pieces and share in different contexts, or CTAs that they can place in different places around the site for different contexts. They're probably more well placed to take advantage of things like personalization, because even though there's more work in coming up with variations on content, they're going to because their website is income generating, they actually have a chance to have all of that work pay off. But startups and e-commerce situations are probably much more likely to be staffed with people who are, who have been involved in content marketing for a long time, who understand the concepts and the way that these things work. universities, I think, have a lot of the same things. Like it's obviously very valuable for them to convert students into, not just applications, but actually accepted students. They could probably do some with personalization depending on the context their students are coming from. They have a lot of shared marketing messages that they can, spread across their site in different contexts and reasons. The problem is that they often don't have the maturity in their communication staff or their content editing staff to support those things. And that's where I see a lot of those projects fail. And that's why a lot of times I get in with universities and like we have to have a little bit of a, come to Jesus talk about it, because it's like they want to do all of this complex stuff, but they're not staffed to do it and they're not in a position to change that.
Staffed both from a perspective of maturity, but also just workload. They've
Absolutely.
so many universities are and increasingly are understaffed and
Yeah.
they're sometimes they're over centralized and sometimes they're like sort of over decentralized and yeah, I found it's very case by case basis what they're able to do or not. Now I know that your book probably doesn't touch on this, but I am compelled to ask. Gotta mention AI. We're talking about content. Got to talk about AI. It's kind of it's what you got to do in 2024. What are your thoughts? What are you seeing? What are your clients asking about? What are you doing?
I have played with some things, and I think my approach to AI is extremely pragmatic, and that's my approach to most things, if I'm honest. And pragmatic and some level of skepticism. I mean, I think that what we see is interesting. I'm seeing as many horror stories as I am success stories, which is not to say that there aren't success stories, but especially for our more, like when we look at somebody like a government client, they value stability and predictability, and that's not what AI is bringing to the table right now. Where I do see a lot of potential is in taking care of some of the complexity that the web requires, without putting that complexity back on the content authors. So, for instance, like meta descriptions is a great example. Like it's so hard to explain to somebody who doesn't understand the web what a meta description is for and how to write one in a way that'd be successful. And we struggle with it all the time. All they do is copy the first two sentences from their body text and paste it in there. And so to have something that could actually summarize the content of your page in a way that would be useful in that context without the author having to deal with it would be awesome. Alt text is another example, where if we could get something that was automated and trustworthy enough to take care of a lot of that, I'm not going to call it busy work because it's not busy work. It's very important. But the stuff that turns into a blocker for a less mature content author to deal with, but which is absolutely necessary for the modern web, I think that would be really, really helpful and useful. I was playing around today or just last week with a tool that generated summaries of PDFs that I was really interested in, because again, a lot of like when we look at like SLED clients, like state, local education clients, they deal with a lot of PDFs, and PDFs are not the greatest format, obviously, for a lot of things. They're not mobile friendly. They're often not very accessible, etc. And all of those clients are, many of them have faced accessibility lawsuits in their past or their near future. And so like getting that stuff remediated is really important. And so figuring out ways to sort of, bring AI to help deal with the PDF problem, I think is really interesting and something we've been thinking about. So like in the short term, those are the kinds of things that I see. I think another thing that we've talked about that would be really great, especially for government clients, is the ability to translate something that's bureaucratic ease into more plain language. I think would be really helpful. So I think all of those things are really interesting potential applications. Whether they're really there yet, I don't think so, but they are like, these are things that are very on the ground, very useful, not pie in the sky stuff that I could see us getting to at some point in the nearest future.
I really I really love the applications of using summaries, using key takeaways, uh, being able to accelerate people's ability to create content and understand content, but not fundamentally create content.
Right.
So, in like a lot of people, the sort of cliche go to about AI is, oh, it's a great like content creation partner, and it is
Mm-hmm.
like that. It absolutely is, and um, that's a lot of people's go to answer, and that's a valid answer. Uh, but it's very dangerous to use that as the actual composition partner
Right.
in creating content. Um, but I've attended a couple of AI conferences over the past few weeks, and unsurprisingly, these conferences are very marketing focused. So a lot of
Yeah.
marketing agencies show up at these, and they're using them for client research.
Mm.
And one of the most interesting takeaways, and this is such a like a I don't know, this seems like such a like a dull fact to take away from something as interesting as AI. But the most interesting thing that stuck with me was that when it comes to prompt engineering, the ideal prompt length is 450 words. So get this. Uh, you use the AI to help you write the prompt,
Write your
to
prompts.
prompt the AI. It's so Inception. But it's true, like that's actually what they're doing, and it's good and it works. Like it's so weirdly like it's the snake eating its tail. It's so strange, but it really does work. But the levels of research they're able to suss out of this stuff, and the way that you communicate with an AI when you're dealing with prompts of that size is
Hmm.
just so unusual. It's so and it's very human. It's as though you are talking with an intern or like a junior level researcher. You frame things from the perspective of hey, I pretend I'm this or pretend you're that, and I want these things in this format, and drill into this thing, and remember to search the internet and cite your sources and do this stuff, and like you really explain what you want to a pretty precise level of detail. And you of course have to check your facts, but these marketing and advertising agencies use it to do background research on clients and industries and competitive analysis and things like that. And it shortens, according to them, it shortens the amount of time it takes to do that research, 5-10 fold.
Yeah.
And it seems to be pretty powerful. Now, I mean, in the web agency world, that's not exactly what we do, but I could
Right.
see how that could be applied to the competitive RFP process pretty easily. So one of the things that we've started to do, you mentioned PDFs. There are some services out there where you can upload PDFs and then query against them.
Query them. Yeah. Yeah.
So you can talk to PDFs, which is something
Hmm.
that oh, what a future we live in where I can finally talk
Yeah.
to a PDF.
Yeah. Especially when you think about an RFP,
Yeah. Yeah,
some of which are
exactly.
very long and
It's
obtuse.
useful. It's useful, but also sort of dismal.
Yeah.
Finally, I get to talk to an RFP PDF. This is what I've
uh,
been waiting for. Well,
the
thank you
world
so
is an
much.
amazing place.
Yes, that's right. The future is strange and oddly boring.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Greg, for your time. And your book, Designing Content Authoring Experiences, is on Kickstarter. The Kickstarter ends on
March
uh,
14th.
March 14th. There will be a link in the show notes to back it. You have a couple of packages available. There's an ebook, there's a print book, there's a combo package. Anything else that people ought to know? Is there anything else that you'd like to plug?
No, I don't think so. I appreciate you having me on and getting to talk about this. And it's whether the book funds or not. this is something that I'll be continuing to speak about and work. That all of that stuff is going to make its way into the world one way or the other. And so I just hope that we can continue this conversation in the Drupal world and outside the Drupal world, and keep making things better for content authors.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Greg, and I will see you at the next Drupal event. I'm sure.
Can't wait.
Sounds good.